Right, good evening everyone. Thank you very much for coming along. John's given a very nice introduction there, he's given you a good sense of what I'm going to be talking about. So I'll just go straight into it. So really, during the Second World War, when Greece was occupied by Germany and the Italians, this organisation, S.O.E., the Special Operations Executive, sent in to Greece about 200 British, Greek, Commonwealth soldiers, specially trained to work with the Greek resistance and carry out acts of sabotage. Now, this evening I'm going to talk to you about the physical and mental challenges that they faced while they were here. And I particularly want to bring home two things: how varied those challenges were. This wasn't a conventional battleground, of course. It was a different style of warfare. These weren't frontline soldiers that you associate perhaps with regular fighting. And I'm also going to talk about the psychological impact of the experience on British personnel of being here during the war, because in some cases this had a very significant impact on their mental health. I'm going to be drawing on declassified records from Kew, one or two memoirs here in the archives at the British School as well. And I'll put up some extracts from some documents, so you may want to have your reading glasses handy if you have any. But I'm going to start by giving you a few examples of the sort of men that S.O.E. sent into Greece to give you some context and some background and some idea of who they were and also how they were recruited. So this is the first team that S.O.E. sent into Greece. It was codenamed Harling, and it was sent in September 1942. And it was dropped by parachute into central Greece from planes flying from North Africa. Now, September 1942, Europe was dominated by the Italians and the Germans in particular, of course, by then, the Balkans mainly under Italian domination. There are several features, aspects of this photograph which are typical of British personnel who were sent here. One is that they're all men, as you can see. They're also all in British Army uniform. So these are soldiers, first and foremost. They're engaged in guerrilla warfare. They're operating in areas where they could afford to wear uniforms and they could afford to carry weapons openly. They didn't have to adopt disguises and grow enormous beards and live in caves, as sometimes they had to do on some of the smaller islands, for example. Those of you familiar with some of the S.O.E.'s operations in Crete, the enemy was closer to them then, and they had to make more use of local disguise, not knowing when the Germans would appear. But in Greece, a lot of missions were relatively isolated. Less visible in the photograph, of course, are some of the distinctions among these men as individuals. They have different roles, and some of them have different backgrounds. This is Eddie Myers, Lieutenant Colonel Edmund Myers, who was the oldest man in this photograph at the age of 36. He was also in charge of them. You can see him fourth from right, without a hat. Actually, they've all got no hats, but this is him here. Now, Myers had no Greek background at all. He was a regular soldier in the Royal Engineers. He was trained in explosives, demolitions, sabotage, and trained in parachuting. And he'd been specifically recruited to take this team into Greece to sabotage the Gorgopotomos viaduct north of Athens. For those of you who may know about that, or may not know about it, this is a viaduct north of Athens over which the main German rail route from the Balkans down to Athens took. And the idea was, if that could be disrupted, it would disrupt German supplies to North Africa. And the hope was that it would be a significant disruption at the time of Al Alamein, which was in October 42. The attack took place late in November 42, but was successful. And the original plan had called for the entire team to then be pulled out of Greece, but it then received orders to stay, and Myers received orders to be the senior officer with the Greek resistance. So this is how you get Myers, who had no Greek background and no knowledge of the Greek language, how he became the senior officer, nevertheless, with the Greek resistance for a year and a half. Standing next to him is this man. This is Chris Woodhouse, who's looking a little bit more unsoldierly, I suppose. He was Myers' second in command. He's 25 years old in both photographs. He was an Oxford-educated classical scholar. He'd actually been here at the British School in 1939, although not officially. I think he'd used its facilities. And he joined the army when war broke out. Myers was a regular soldier, joined in the 30s, early 30s. Woodhouse, fresh to the army. Before joining this team, he'd been in Greece and fought in Crete in 41. He'd also spent some time as an undercover agent in Crete, making contacts with the Cretan resistance. He spoke Greek. When Myers left Greece in 43, Woodhouse took over and remained the senior officer to the Greek resistance, more or less until the end of the war. They weren't all British. This is Lieutenant Themi Marinos, 25 years old in this photograph, a Greek artillery officer who fought in Albania and then captured in Crete. He then escaped into the mountains and was later evacuated by British submarine to Egypt, where he joined the British. Most SOE personnel were British, but a significant share were Greek, and they don't appear perhaps as much as they should do in some of the memoirs about SOE and some of the accounts and histories about it. Nor were they all officers. This is Doug Phillips, sergeant. You can see him at the bottom right there. In fact, all three kneeling down there are radio operators. NCOs, other ranks, soldiers who weren't officers, tended to have these jobs. So these are radio operators, sabotage experts, skilled in demolitions. But Doug Phillips is probably typical of them. No Greek background again, couldn't speak Greek. He was from Cumberland in the north of England, had joined the army when he was 14 years old, and he's 20 years old in this photograph. I'll mention him again later. Now, when the British started sending men in, September 42, and for the months that followed, there was a sense that there was a feeling inside SOE that the right sort of people were commando-type individuals, soldiers who were well-trained, fit, energetic, young, good at fighting. Recruitment was also extremely informal. Dennis Hampson, who is second from left, Marinos is at the left, right on the end there, and Dennis Hampson, just to his left, was recruited for this mission 2 days before it left. So there was no real selection process as such. As the war wore on, however, selection methods became a bit more sophisticated. Intelligence tests and performance tests were introduced. There was an interview with a psychiatrist. And one psychiatrist involved in this work felt that it was impossible to be certain to predict how men would react. But he also felt that it at least weeded out the vulnerable, and that the men he was selecting could perhaps had a better chance of withstanding some of the strains and challenges that awaited them. Also, over time, SOE began to identify the characteristics of certain individuals, the aspects of their personalities and characters that might suit them better than others to this sort of guerrilla warfare, this style of fighting. Physical stamina and basic soldiering skills were always felt to be important, but there was always there became a feeling that men with experience of the world, sensible, intelligent, that they had something to offer and were perhaps better at it than your average commando-type soldier. And these are two quotes from original SOE files. This comes from an SOE report in 1945. Young commando officers who expected to carry out a raid or blow a bridge at least once a week tended to become depressed when they found that their main job was to settle disputes between rival guerrilla bands and to allocate boots and clothing. The most successful type was a good all-rounder, good mixer, fair amount of experience dealing with foreigners, a capacity for organisation, balanced judgment, common sense. And a little more succinctly from a chap called Basil Davidson, who was in Yugoslavia, but the same thing applied. This is a quote from his memoir. In the end, we found it a good general rule to refuse the hard-bitten commando type and accept the ordinary, straightforward chap who learned to cut no special kind of caper and possibly could put two thoughts together and make sense. Now, a good illustration of this sort of evolved thinking is in the selection of this man. This is John Cook, John's predecessor as director of the school between 1947 1946 and 1954. Cook had been a student here in the 1930s at the British School. When the war broke out, he was lecturer in Latin and classical archaeology at Edinburgh University. He joined S.O.E. in April 1943, trained at special schools in Britain and Palestine, and then parachuted into Greece in September 1943. He was here for over a year, working mainly in central Greece, Epirus and Thessaly, and afterwards was mentioned dispatches for his work here. Now, Cook's file was declassified not that long ago. The files of S.O.E. have been declassified from the late 1990s, but continue to be released today. And these are two extracts from his files about him, which were made on him during training. An awkward person physically, very hard of vision at night, and almost invariably unpunctual. He's not my idea of a commando-type officer. He is, however, intelligent, keen, and has taken a real interest in the training. Done his level best, has intelligence, is enthusiastic, has guts despite his poor physique, a visionary, absent-minded, almost completely myopic. He's not suited to be a commando officer this side of heaven, but he has the individuality and academic tenacity to be an excellent liaison officer. And so he proved. Now, to give you an idea of the range of risks and dangers that Cook and others faced while they were here, I thought I'd illustrate this with individual cases and case studies of individual operatives who were sent here during the war. These are two graves in the British cemetery at Phaleron, down by the coast. On the left, Flight Lieutenant Konstantin Dracoulis. Known as Didi, he was Greek and born out here, but brought up and educated in Britain. When the war broke out, he was working in London for his father's shipping business. He then joined the RAF and then was seconded to S.O.E., transferred to S.O.E. on account of his fluent Greek. On the right, Battery Sergeant Major Frederick James Richmond, who had already fought in North Africa with the SAS against the Germans. Now, to get into Greece, the majority of S.O.E. personnel who went were dropped by parachute, flying from airfields in North Africa and later on from Italy. Parachuting was still an evolving art, and it was dangerous. On the night of 10th of May 1943, when both of these men were dropped from the same aircraft, the wind was so high that both men suffered fatal head injuries when they landed. And as you can see, they're both buried together at Phaleron. Now, once in Greece, of course, personnel were exposed to a greater diversity of danger once they were here. And inevitably, some of it took the shape of the enemy. Many of you will be familiar with this plaque inside the hostel and the library to 3 former members of the school who were killed in the Second World War. Many of you will be familiar with John Pendlebury, who's at the bottom there. Captain John Pendlebury, killed in Crete in 1941 while working with S.O.E. with the Cretan resistance. You may be less familiar with David Wallace at the top there. Wallace had been educated at Eton College and Oxford and later joined the Foreign Office. He'd been in Greece in 1937 to 39, again at the British School as a student, specialising in Byzantine studies, and had also been here between 1939 and 41 as a member of the British Embassy, or the British Consul, I think it was then. He joined S.O.E. in 1943. In 1944, he was sent into Epirus to work with Zervas's Edes movement and was killed when he was supposed to be observing, not taking part. He was observing an Edes attack on a German post between Igoumenitsa and Yanina, and was just killed randomly by a German machine gun. And he was some way away from the action. Pendlebury, as some of you may know, was caught first, wounded, and then killed as a prisoner. Being executed as a prisoner was not to be an unusual fate for S.O.E. personnel captured in Greece and in Crete. This is Apostolos Evangelou from Leros. An example, again, of one of S.O.E.'s Greek personnel. You don't really find him written about much. He'd been a professor of mathematics in Patras before the war, had studied at the University of Athens. He'd been recruited in the Middle East and then assigned to operations in Crete, and he'd gone to Crete in 1942 as a radio operator, and he'd worked in Crete with Zan Fielding and Patrick Lee Firmer. First with Fielding and then with Patrick Lee Firmer, names that will be familiar to any of you who know much about S.O.E. operations in Crete, and of course Lee Firmer has many other reasons to be well known. Evangeli was working as Lee Firmer's radio operator when he was captured in a house in Vafe and then taken to Chania, where he was tortured and eventually shot. A number of British personnel suffered the same fate, British personnel as opposed to Greeks. One officer was caught on Antiparos and later killed. A three-man team sent to sabotage the Corinth Canal were captured, taken to Germany, imprisoned in concentration camps and later executed. There's also Captain Alan Warren, who was an S.O.E. officer who'd been working in mainland Greece and was caught off the coast of Kefalonia in 1944. Some of you may be familiar with, as a character in Louis de Bernier's book, Captain Cray's Mandolin, there's a character there called Bunny Warren, who's presented as a rather buffoonish, upper-class English officer who arrives in Greece speaking only ancient Greek. This is supposed to be based on, supposedly linked to Alan Warren, Captain Alan Warren. It's rather unfair. The real Warren was an Australian, had been born in Australia, quite a hard-bitten Australian, a former ship's purser, had been in the army for some time, joined S.O.E., was sent into mainland Greece, and he was in the process of shipping some Russian soldiers, escaped Russian prisoners of war, from Greece to Italy when the wind changed, the kite that he was sailing ran out of fuel, and it was blown back towards Kefalonia, where it was picked up by the Germans. Warren was taken to Salonika, where he was executed. Now, life in Greece could be full of plenty of risk, or there'd be plenty of risk in Greece when the enemy were nowhere near. These are two more graves at Phaleron. That's Kenneth Walker on the left, and this is Doug Phillips on the right, the radio operator I showed you earlier on, kneeling down. On one night in May 1944, both these men were working on a railway line at Phassala in Thessaly, southern Thessaly, when the explosives they were laying exploded prematurely and they were both killed. This is James Russon, Royal Engineers, who was killed while lifting landmines, German landmines, towards the end of 1944. The Germans had all but left by then, and he was he was just doing disposal work, mine disposal work. Then from 1943, the outbreak of fighting in Greece between left and right, Eles, Edes, created additional dangers. The British were often caught in the middle of this. Occasionally they were even targeted deliberately by Edes, who resented the fact that S.O.E. was supplying their rivals with stores and ammunition and weapons and explosives and so on. This is at the grave of Arthur Hubbard, again at Phaleron. Hubbard, as you can see, was a New Zealander. He'd been sent into Greece in September 43. In fact, he'd parachuted from the same plane as John Cook. A month later, after arriving, October 1943, Hubbard had been staying with two other British personnel in a house in Triclino in Epirus. I think it's Epirus. It's either Romelli or southern Epirus. Can't quite work it out. Anyway, one night, the house they were in was suddenly attacked by Edes forces. And Hubbard went outside to remonstrate and was seriously wounded. He was shot, seriously wounded in the stomach and chest. The other two British personnel he was with put their hands up and went outside to try to effectively explain, as Hubbard had been doing, try and explain what had been going on and remonstrate with the attackers, explain that they were British. One of them was Major Bill Jordan, another New Zealander, who later described what happened next. About 30 frenzied guerrillas swept on us and immediately commenced to knock us about. I indignantly said I was a British major and demanded immediate medical attention for Hubbard. About the only intelligible remarks I could gather were the repetition of the words Zervas and traitor. Suddenly, one of them placed the end of the barrel of his rifle hard against my temple, and both Abbots, who was the other British soldier, the radio operator, and I were dragged, pushed, and buffeted down the slope a little way from the house. They stood us against a bank, and three guerrillas lifted their rifles, and came up on aim to shoot us. and a voice from the top of the hill demanded what was going on. The rifles were lowered. Jordan then explains that an LS doctor was called forward to examine Arthur Hubbard, who was lying grievously wounded on the ground. They brought him inside the house. The doctor examined him, then took Jordan aside and explained there was nothing that he could do. And then Jordan's report, which I won't read out, continues. Now, unsurprisingly, the reactions among British personnel to incidents like this and to the Civil War in general ranged from feelings of anger, frustration and disgust to utter disillusionment. Some question what they were doing here. I mean, what were they fighting for if Greeks were fighting each other more readily? Some also question the priorities and policies of the British government, which they felt was sometimes excessively sympathetic to the Greek monarchy. The British here could see that the average Greek was no monarchist. Some also felt that Hellas, for all its faults, was nevertheless the most anti-fascist organisation here, the one you could rely on if you really wanted to kill Germans and Italians. It was the most effective form of anti-German resistance. And of course, many British were witnesses to the aftermath of appalling atrocities inflicted by Greeks on other Greeks, just as they were often witnesses to other realities of guerrilla warfare, the torture and execution of traitors, the execution of prisoners by Greeks, the execution by Greeks of Italians and Germans, the execution of Italians by Germans after Italian surrender, and then the widespread burning of villages and the killing of civilians, particularly by German soldiers. There was also the countryside, and the terrain itself, to the environment to deal with. British personnel here had to contend with a great deal. They were organised across the country in individual missions, as they were called, little teams, little groups. And they mostly lived a very outdoor life, of a very basic existence too. The terrain, especially in the more mountainous areas, could be extremely challenging. Movement was mostly on foot. Huge distances had to be covered, again on foot. The climate too could be extreme. In winter, for example, missions in the mountains risked frostbite and exposure. In the summer, temperatures shot up and they had to deal with dehydration and the heat. This is Captain William Ronald Phillips, British officer, dropped into Greece in 43. January 44, he was a member of a mission in Macedonia that the Germans chased through the mountains for 3 weeks. Throughout that period, they were outdoors overnight, almost every night. Conditions were appalling. Other members of the party that Phillips was with had frostbite, exposure, and Phillips himself died of a combination of pneumonia and tonsillitis. Sickness and disease were in fact constant hazards. There were day-to-day irritations like lice, fleas, scabies, boils, other skin diseases. Diet could be extremely poor. There was a lot of weight loss, and of course, poor diet just made illness, could make men even more susceptible to sickness. There were also some very serious conditions as well. Sandy Campbell had been sent into Greece in March 1944, died in June in Romelli of what was thought to be typhoid fever, which is associated with contaminated food, contaminated water. James Marsden, sent to Greece in September 43 and died just a month later. Another one of S.O.E's radio operators died a month later of black water fever, which is a severe complication of malaria. Malaria, always a serious problem in Greece. It could obviously be lethal, but also not in the ways that you might expect. I'm going to turn now to the psychological impact of work in Greece, and I think it's important in this respect to include this case. This is the grave of a British Sergeant Major who'd been sent into Greece in September 43, again coincidentally from the same aircraft that John Cook dropped in from. A month later, he was at the headquarters of Bill Jordan, again the New Zealand officer I mentioned earlier, who had to deal with Arthur Hubbard's death. And this Sergeant Major was at that headquarters in Epirus when he became seriously ill with malaria and then shot himself. Jordan, incidentally, had to cope with Arthur Hubbard's death just 3 days after this. Now, this is Jordan's report on the suicide. It's obviously committed suicide. There's not a shred of evidence to show why he did it, nor did he give an indication that he would do anything like it. He was a big, hearty, heavily built man, aged 35, married with 2 children. He was a particularly cheerful type, and it appears to me that he took his own life on a sudden impulse during post-malarial depression. I might add that there's much malaria in Valtos at present, and I've been frightfully ill with it myself. And then Jordan later wrote, 25 years later, wrote a memoir of his work in Greece. And this is a passage again dealing with this incident. We never solved the mystery. There seemed only one conclusion with the aid of medical opinion. The type of malaria in this part of the country was notorious for the state of depression in which it often left its victims. Certainly it had knocked my men about. Dr. Hutas, as a doctor in local practice and as a malaria victim himself, was well aware of the symptoms and the after effects. Experts from the Carnegie Institute, he explained, had agreed that the form of malaria found in Valtos was extremely vicious and often left its victims in a thoroughly miserable state. Just sort of to lift myself out of the presentation for a minute, this is I find this very important, and if anyone has any thoughts or comments as where I could find out more about malaria and its effect on mental health, please do drop me a line or speak to me afterwards or bring it up in the Q&A when I'm done. Now, in memoirs and reports like Jordan's, you can find several references to British personnel becoming seriously ill with malaria, becoming exhausted with their experiences here, overworked, mentally worn out, and sometimes depressed for other reasons, unconnected with being here. So, for example, they could get bad news from home, and that could spiral into a certain degree of depression in some cases. What's interesting, though, is that it's hard to find other cases of, as you'd say, catastrophic psychological breakdown among men who were here while they were here. If this makes sense. I'll explain that. This is psychiatrist, British Army psychiatrist Alexander Kennedy, who very unusually for S.O.E, most personnel who came out from enemy territory around the world weren't screened for their mental health afterwards. But Kennedy took a special interest in this. And officers coming out of Greece, some of them went through his hands. This happened in late 1944, just after the Germans had left. And quite a number went to see Kennedy after they'd finished in the mountains here. And he did his best to assess their mental health. His observations are quite interesting. For example, he noted that many officers, when their work ended in Greece, had what he called a severe temporary breakdown. As he put it, as soon as they reached safety, he puts it rather facetiously, they developed intense anxiety states, they were quite unable to sleep and so forth, and I put them in a hotel and let them drink a bit and fight it out among themselves, and they then recovered and were perfectly all right. He's sort of making somewhat like, that's not a clinical report, that's more him just. He also felt, though, that neurosis had been absent among officers while they'd been in Greece, and this was because he said that, if this makes sense, there'd been no escape for them, there'd been no, in other words, it was impossible for them to go anywhere, there was no escape route, they had to keep focus on the jobs they had to do, and there'd be no room really for a flight response, if you like, if you get that. He didn't go into precise symptoms, but he's probably describing what today is called combat stress reaction, which is actually a normal and temporary reaction. It's seen as a normal and temporary reaction to being under prolonged and extreme stress, physical and physiological stress, where the symptoms, which are impatience, irritation, restlessness, hyper-awareness, are actually seen as normative, adaptive, and beneficial. in those particular extreme circumstances. Now, it's certainly the case that many personnel seemed to have been perfectly okay when they came out. There were many who viewed their experiences in a wholly positive light. They saw it as an intense experience, but one that was highly memorable, that it was intense, exhilarating, romantic even, and enjoyable even. Many felt they'd been doing something useful. And for some also, they'd had a freedom and control over their military careers that they might not have had if they'd stayed in the regular military. And that appealed to a great many of them in the first place when they volunteered. It's also clear, however, that some suffered very badly and were not picked up by the psychiatrists. There were no follow-ups, and there were no long-term monitoring, and not everybody was screened anyway. At least one officer developed very serious, extreme, depressive, self-destructive symptoms that would probably be diagnosed today as post-traumatic stress disorder. Another possible example was a British officer called Bill Killick, who'd spent 14 months in Greece between October 1943 and the end of 1944. Now, he goes through Kennedy's hands, and in S.O.E. files where you'd expect to find Kennedy flagging his mental health if it were seen as bad, there's nothing like that. When he came out of Greece, he's described as very fit and energetic and wholly suitable for operations in the Far East against the Japanese. This is a newspaper cutting a few weeks later about Killick's trial and acquittal on a charge of intention to commit murder. This happened back in the UK just weeks after his return there from Greece. The whole episode is rather bizarre. The would-be victim, the target of Killick's attentions, was Dylan Thomas, the poet. So in a nutshell, Killick was staying with his wife in Cardigan Bay in South Wales in a little cottage, and one evening his wife was at Thomas's cottage nearby. They all knew each other, and Killick suddenly burst in with a machine gun and a grenade and started firing the machine gun about, and nobody was hurt, but everyone was pretty livid, and there was an arrest, and Killick was taken to court. Now, in looking at this case, it's important to be dogmatic, not to be dogmatic about the precise what actually was going on. Killick himself told the court that it was just a joke, that it was just a prank. That's the bluff referred to here. He just thought he'd like to shake people up a bit. Since the war, in biographies of Dylan Thomas, there's also been a film with Keira Knightley in it, playing Killick's wife, of this particular incident, mainly focused on Thomas, inevitably. And they have different reasons. And that Killick was, I think afterwards the family themselves feel that Killick had reason to be suspicious of Thomas. He didn't like Thomas because Thomas had spent his war peacefully at home. Killick obviously had a different war. But this was a generation, of course, that didn't really talk openly about its mental health, express emotion much, perhaps, at least about conditions to do with the war. And of course, he's a soldier, and he's a young soldier in his 20s. And there was a culture then, of course, in the military where it's not really sort of heart under the sleeve environment. And there was a definite suggestion in the court that Killick's experiences in Greece had a part to play in his behaviour. A statement was provided by his commanding officer in Greece, who was Chris Woodhouse, who I mentioned right at the beginning, that Killick had worked, this was read to the court, that Killick had worked in the most difficult and dangerous area of Greece with a group that had suffered exceedingly. It actually included the officer I mentioned earlier who died of tonsillitis and pneumonia. Killick was also quoted as telling a woman in the pub immediately before this incident that she didn't know what it had been like out there, by which he meant Greece. It's also apparent that some British personnel may not necessarily have been left traumatised by their experiences, but were certainly left with long-term feelings of unease and perhaps guilt about the consequences of some of their actions, or the actions of the British in general in Greece, especially concerning German reprisals. I'm going to give you two examples. This is John Mulgan. John Mulgan, a New Zealander, one of the outstanding SOE officers in Greece. Afterwards, a book written by him called Report on Experience, really one of the finest books on, doesn't deal entirely with his experiences in Greece, but it's really one of the outstanding books on the war, actually, in my opinion, let alone just about the aspect that he was involved in, which are operations in Greece and fighting in North Africa. He'd had a very tough time in the thick of the fighting, working with LS, working well with LS troops. Saw a lot of fighting, took part in a lot of it himself, witnessed a lot of reprisals. And after the war, after leaving Greece, he had an important role to play, and he was sent back to Athens to work on really just sweeping up SOE's administration in Greece. And one of his roles was to deal with claims for compensation from Greeks who'd worked for SOE and suffered. So he also had a rather brutal introduction to, if he needed any more introduction to it, brutal awareness of really what the impact on the Greek population had been from cooperating with the British. This is a quote from his memoir, Report on Experience. How many hanged hostages balanced the enemy's loss of a wrecked locomotive? One needed to be of a rather less than average sensibility to take pleasure in sabotage exploits against this background. If you meet in after days men who pride themselves on partisan exploits, question them a little more closely on the matter of reprisals and the danger which they themselves incurred. Myself, I remember of many times going down to the railway line on some far from desperate project, look on the faces of peasant women who, knowing we were working there and that reprisals would follow, were loading the family donkeys with what they thought might be saved from the wrath to come. Mulgan was a sensitive man. There's a very good biography of him by Vincent Sullivan, a New Zealander. Mulgan then took his own life a few months after, in early 45, and there's a feeling that certainly he was suffering from depression, and there are strong feelings that his experiences was a strong belief, really, and I don't think you can escape it by looking at his diaries and letters at the time, that his experiences in Greece had affected him very badly. Some of you may be familiar, well, I'm sure some of you will be familiar with this. These are photographs from Life magazine. I'm moving on to the second example. Photographs from Life magazine from November 1944, concerned with Distimo, the massacre at Distimo near Delphi, where a German SS unit massacred the population on the 10th of June 1944. Those killings were a reprisal for an attack on an SS unit not far away by an LS unit. Now, there's an interesting interview at the Imperial War Museum in London that has a bearing on Distimo and what happened there that June. This is Brian Dillon, an SOE officer who was in Greece in 43 and 44, and the interview was recorded with him in 2002. In the interview, he talks about how a few days prior to the massacre, he'd been operating in that very close by. He'd gone to another village nearby called Despina, which isn't far from Distimo, to share news of the Allied landings in Normandy, which of course happened on the 6th of June. He thought this was good news. He thought the locals might like that. Now, just after his arrival in Despina, the Germans arrived, and he very narrowly escaped capture. He just made it out. Now, Dillon in his interview explains that the LS unit, the local LS unit, which was supposed to have been protecting him, guarding him, and he got on well with them, felt very guilty at the fact that he'd been almost captured. And he says that in response, they then attacked this SS unit to really just hit back, to show that they could do something. And Dillon says that it was in retaliation for that action, that LS action, that Distimo massacre happened. And he says that an SS unit went to punish Despina, but got the wrong village and went to Distimo instead, and that's what happened. And this is a quote from the interview here, explaining what happened next. The SS officer in charge had a Greek map which he couldn't read properly. He got to the village of Distomo, which was between Navaja and Despina. It was entirely innocent, had nothing to do with any of this. The villagers were going about their work the normal way. The Germans surrounded the village and killed every man, woman and child and burnt the village to the ground. A mistake, and I've had it on my conscience forever. If I hadn't gone to Despina, it would never have happened. Many years later, taking the family to Delphi, we had to go through Distomo, and I saw a statue that the Greeks had erected. It said, "Here on the 10th of June, 1944, the Germans murdered 223. Their names hereunder." And there they were, all listed, children, women, a lot. Now, there are some issues that can be taken with Dylan's account, of course. Even if he was correct in his chain of events, and there's a question mark over that, I think you can rightly question his degree of perspective on what happened. He wasn't an SS soldier at Distomo. He wasn't part of the LS unit that had attacked the SS previously. He hadn't encouraged LS to attack them. It's difficult to see how he could have predicted what would have happened from what was supposed to have been, an innocent visit to a neighbouring village. And of course, he wasn't responsible for the German occupation of Greece, and nor was he responsible for the conditions that in which LS organised itself as a resistance movement. But nevertheless, you have a man here still talking about his guilt 60 years later. Okay, I'll finish here, but just to sum up, there were 2 points really that I wanted to bring out. One was the range of dangers and difficulties that they faced really, that were associated with this kind of warfare. The causes of strain can be quite different to what you find on conventional battlefields. And the second point is the care that I think you need to take when you're trying to interpret or looking at cases of psychological breakdown at a distance of 75 years. Today it can be tempting to interpret everything or see everything through the lens of post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course there were cases of severe breakdown among British personnel who'd been here in Greece. But what I wanted to show is that the impact of war is quite complex and it can take other forms as well. I'll stop there. Thank you.